The night Sloane Whitfield walked into her own office to find a stranger sitting behind her desk, she wasn't afraid. She was furious. The stranger wasn't rifling through her files or stealing equipment. He was reading, a worn paperback held loosely in one hand, the other wrapped around a coffee mug that definitely hadn't come from the executive floor kitchen. He looked completely at ease, like a man who'd spent years making himself comfortable in spaces that didn't belong to him. "You're in my chair," Sloane said. He looked up, dark eyes unhurried, the kind of face that had clearly been handsome before something hard happened to it. There was a scar along his jaw, thin and pale, old enough that he'd stopped noticing it years ago. "Ms. Whitfield." He set the book down. "I was told to wait here. Security let me up. Security lets a lot of people up. That doesn't explain why you're sitting in my chair." He stood, and she registered the height, taller than she'd expected from the file she'd been sent. 6 feet and change, dressed in clothes that were clean but clearly not purchased with a boardroom in mind. Work boots, dark jeans, a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the pattern had faded to something that might once have been plaid. "Cole Merritt," he said, and extended his hand. She didn't take it. "I know who you are. What I don't know is why my assistant booked you into my personal office instead of the meeting room downstairs. She said you preferred the privacy. Something about the walls in the meeting rooms being too thin for sensitive conversations." He paused. Her words, not mine. That was true. Sloane made a mental note to have a conversation with her assistant about the definition of sensitive. "Sit down," she said, moving to her own chair and reclaiming it. "Not there." She pointed to the chair across the desk, the one that was very clearly subordinate to hers. He sat without comment, picked up his coffee again, and waited, which should have been unremarkable. Waiting was something people did constantly in her office. She was CEO of Hartwell Capital, and people who wanted things from her learned to wait. But most of them fidgeted, checked their phones, rehearsed their pitch under their breath like she couldn't see their lips moving. Cole Merritt just waited, completely still, like a man who had learned long ago that patience was the one thing that couldn't be taken from you. "You've been contracted for the restoration project," Sloane said, pulling up the file on her screen. "The Brackmore building. Heritage designation, which means every modification needs provincial approval, which means this project will take approximately 3 times longer and cost approximately twice as much as the initial estimates suggested. Closer to 2.5 times, Cole said. The estimates were optimistic. I know that now. I also know that the last contractor who touched the Brackmore managed to void our heritage certification through improper material substitution, which is why we're starting over and why my board is extremely unhappy with me." She looked up from the screen. "So, Mr. Merritt, you specialize in heritage restoration. Your firm, if 3 people in a work van constitute a firm, has completed 14 projects in the past 6 years, all on time, all approved by the provincial authority on first submission. No substitutions, no violations. How?" "I do the work correctly," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer there is." Sloane studied him. She'd interviewed 8 contractors in the past 3 weeks, and they'd all brought the same things. Glossy portfolios, project timelines built on magical thinking, and a very particular kind of confidence that she'd learned to recognize as the opposite of competence. This man had brought a paperback novel and a coffee he'd apparently made himself somewhere. "The board wants me to go with Aldermac Construction," she said. "They have 400 employees, 3 heritage certifications, and a full insurance package. They also subcontract their skilled labor to the same 2 firms, one of which used composite materials on the Belfort project that failed provincial inspection twice before getting conditional approval." He said it the way someone states a fact they know to be true but aren't particularly interested in repeating. "I looked into it. Figured you had too." She had. "You did your homework. I do the work correctly. That applies to preparation." There was a knock at the door. Sloane glanced up. Her assistant, Priya, leaned in with the expression of someone who has news that is not good but is trying to present it as neutral. "Mrs. Whitfield, the call with Vancouver just moved up. You have about 7 minutes. Fine." Sloane looked back at Cole. "We'll continue this tomorrow. Priya will send you the revised project specs tonight." He stood, picked up the paperback, and tucked it in his jacket pocket with the ease that suggested it had lived there for years. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said by way of goodbye, and walked out. Sloane watched him go and had the uncomfortable feeling that she'd just been assessed and found acceptable, rather than the other way around. She needed to know more about Cole Merritt. What she found wasn't what she expected. His company, Merritt Restoration, no creative naming involved, was exactly as small as it appeared. 3 permanent staff, including himself, a rotating team of specialized tradespeople he'd worked with for years, and a project history that read like someone had been quietly and methodically doing exactly what they said they would do, year after year, without any interest in growing larger or being noticed. His background was harder to find. There was a gap, 7 years roughly, where Cole Merritt had apparently not existed in any searchable capacity. Before that gap, a master's in architectural history from the University of Edinburgh, a junior position at a prestigious heritage consulting firm in London, and a series of conference papers on adaptive reuse of industrial buildings that her research assistant called genuinely respected in the field. After the gap, he'd showed up in Winnipeg 6 years ago with a work van, a heritage certification, and a daughter. The daughter was 6 now. Her name was Bex, short for Rebecca, and she attended Riverview French Immersion and apparently had opinions about croissants that she was not shy about sharing. Sloane knew this because the one personal profile she'd been able to find on Cole Merritt was a brief interview in a neighborhood magazine 2 years ago, where he'd been photographed at a bakery 2 blocks from his house with Bex on his shoulders, both of them squinting in the morning sun. He'd looked different in that photo, not softer, exactly, but less armored. Like the space between himself and the world was smaller when his daughter was involved. Where was her mother? The article hadn't said. Cole hadn't volunteered it. Sloane filed the question away and didn't ask. She signed the contract the next morning. The first week on site was professional and unremarkable. Cole arrived early, left late, and communicated primarily through the detailed daily logs he sent to her project manager, a meticulous man named Arthur, who had been sending Sloane increasingly impressed updates. He found a load-bearing issue on the 3rd floor that the original structural assessment missed. Arthur told her on Thursday, "If we'd proceeded without catching it, we'd have been looking at a partial collapse risk by spring. How did he find it?" He walked the floor, by himself, with a flashlight and apparently a very old book about the original construction methods used in Winnipeg in the 1920s. Arthur paused. I asked if he wanted to share the reference. He sent me a bibliography. Sloane visited the site that Friday. She told herself it was routine. She visited all active projects. But the Brackmore was 4 blocks from her office, and she'd been finding reasons to walk past it all week. Cole was on a scaffold on the 2nd floor when she arrived, examining something on the exterior brickwork with a level of attention that most people reserved for things they loved. He came down when Arthur flagged him, pulling off his work gloves and rubbing a hand through his hair, which was a disaster. He clearly cut it himself or didn't cut it at all. Mrs. Whitfield. He nodded. Mr. Merritt. She looked up at the building. The old facade had been cleaned in sections, revealing the original brick beneath decades of accumulated grime. It was remarkable, actually, a warm terracotta that she hadn't expected, richer and more detailed than the gray exterior she'd bought. We found the original corbelling under the 4th floor parapet, Cole said, following her gaze. Someone covered it in the 70s. Stucco over the original detail. It was meant to be an octopus. Sorry? The original architect was Icelandic. There's a motif throughout the upper structure. Small octopuses carved into the corbelling about this big. He held up 2 fingers, showing her perhaps 8 centimeters. Provincial Heritage Authority is going to lose their mind. Despite herself, Sloane smiled. That's actually wonderful. It changes the restoration spec. Not the cost. The details are preserved. We just need to remove the overlay. But it extends the timeline by about 10 days. He looked at her directly, which she was starting to notice he did always, with no hedging. I'm letting you know now rather than Friday. I appreciate that. How's the board taking the timeline? Sloane raised an eyebrow. Contractors don't usually ask me how my board is doing. I'm asking because if there's pressure to accelerate, I need to know before it becomes a conversation about cutting corners rather than after. She looked at him. You're very direct. I do the work correctly, he said, for the 2nd time in 5 days. That requires honest communication early. She held his gaze for a moment. The board is managing. You'll have your 10 days. He nodded, pulled his gloves back on. The scaffolding on the wefts comes down Monday. You should come see the brick in the morning light. It wasn't quite an invitation and it wasn't quite an instruction. And Sloane found herself agreeing before she'd consciously decided to. She came on Monday. The brick was extraordinary in the morning light. Layers of color emerging as Cole's team worked through the cleaning, warm amber and deep red, a century of history becoming visible again under careful hands. Cole walked her through the structure without speaking much, letting the building do the work, pointing occasionally to a detail she would have missed. The way the window arches had been built to direct rainwater, the slight camber in the entrance steps, the ghost of a sign painted directly onto the brick in 1934 that was emerging as they cleaned. A hardware store, from the look of it, someone's name in faded gilt letters. Bergstrom and Son, Cole said. I found the original business registration. The son was named Elias. He was 19 when his father died and ended up running the store alone for 30 years. Sloane looked at the faded letters. You research the history. It matters. You build something that lasts by understanding what came before it. He was quiet for a moment. I brought Bex here last weekend. Showed her the octopuses. The shift in his voice was small but present. Not soft or exactly settled. Like some other version of himself had slipped in alongside the professional one. How old is she? Sloane asked. 6. She told me they should have made them bigger. He paused. She's not wrong. Sloane thought about the photograph from the neighborhood magazine, the way he'd been squinting, the way Bex had been squinting too, same angle, same stubborn angle of chin. Does she come to your sites often? When she can. She likes to see things being fixed. He glanced over. Her word. Not mine. You're raising her alone. It wasn't a question. It came out as one anyway. Cole looked at her steadily. Her mother died when Bex was 2, he said. Accident, icy highway, February. She was driving back from her mother's place. The matter-of-factness of it didn't mean the weight wasn't there. Sloane had learned to hear that particular kind of fact, the ones people had said so many times that they'd worn smooth the edges, but underneath were still completely uneven. I'm sorry, she said. Yeah. He looked back at the brick. Me too. They stood in the cold morning air for a while, not filling it with anything. Sloane couldn't remember the last time she'd stood somewhere and not filled it with a phone or a to-do list or a strategic thought. It was, she realized somewhat uncomfortably, not unpleasant. The complication arrived 6 weeks in, as complications tended to do on a Tuesday, in the form of a man named Douglas Price. Douglas Price was the managing director of Aldermac Construction, the firm her board had wanted in the first place. He was 54, expensively suited, and had the particular energy of a man who considered himself owed things by the universe and was keeping careful track of what hadn't been delivered yet. He had also, Sloane was informed by her VP of Development, just made an offer to acquire Hartwell Capital's entire heritage portfolio, 6 buildings including the Brackmore, for a price that was technically competitive, but which would essentially hand him control of the largest concentration of heritage-designated commercial property in downtown Winnipeg. He doesn't want the buildings, Sloane said, sitting across from her VP in her office and trying to keep her voice neutral. He wants the certifications. That's my read too, said Terrence, who was very good at his job and also terrified of delivering bad news. With those certifications, he can develop on adjacent properties under modified guidelines. The buildings themselves are almost secondary, almost. He'd hold them, probably lease them at heritage standard rates, but the real value to him is the regulatory leverage. Sloane looked at the offer on her screen. It was clean, professional, and represented something she'd spent 4 years building being swallowed by someone who had neither the knowledge nor the interest to steward it properly. He's got 3 board members, she said. 4, if Caldwell votes with him. Which Caldwell might, given the offer price. Caldwell will vote with whoever makes the most compelling case the week before the vote. Sloane closed the file. When's the board meeting? 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks to make a compelling case that Hartwell's heritage portfolio was worth more intact than sold, and to do it in a way that held Caldwell's attention for at least 40 minutes. She called Cole that afternoon. He answered on the second ring. I need you to do something, she said, outside the scope of the contract. What is it? I need a full heritage assessment on all 6 properties, not just the Brackmore. A document that makes clear to a board who does not know or particularly care about architectural history why these buildings matter and what we stand to lose if they're broken up or mishandled. A pause. That's several weeks of work. I know. I'll compensate you for the time. That's not what I meant. Another pause longer. This is about Aldermac. She didn't ask how he knew. Yes, Price would gut the certifications inside 18 months, Cole said, not deliberately. He just doesn't know what he's managing, and he wouldn't hire anyone who does. His voice was level, but she'd learned enough about him by now to hear what sat beneath it. I'll do the assessment. Thank you, Sloane. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed it the way you notice when the temperature changes. You need more than a document. A document gives the board something to read. You need something they feel. What are you suggesting? Bring them to the Brackmore. Let me show them what we've found. Bergstrom's sign. The octopuses. The load-bearing fix, so they understand what it looks like when someone actually knows what they're doing. He paused again. People trust what they can touch. She thought about Monday morning, the cold air, the faded letters emerging from the brick. Thursday after next, she said. Can you be ready? I'm always ready, he said, and she believed him. The weeks that followed were the most concentrated professional effort of Sloane's career, which was saying something. She was at the Brackmore most mornings now, ostensibly reviewing progress, which was real, but not the whole reason. She and Cole worked in the particular way of people who don't waste words, but have learned to hear each other without them. She'd hand him a concern, he'd hand her a solution, and they'd move on without the procedural padding most professional relationships seem to require. He brought Bex to the site on a Saturday when the scaffolding came down from the east face, the side with the best light. Sloane happened to be there. She told herself she'd come for the structural report Arthur had mentioned. Bex was 6 years old and entirely unintimidated by adults, the way children are when they've been treated by their primary adult as someone whose opinions are worth hearing. "You're the one who's letting Dad fix the building," Bex said, looking up at Sloane with the kind of frank assessment that most people abandon by age 7. "That's right. Dad says it's the most interesting building he's worked on since Edinburgh." Sloane glanced at Cole, who was carefully not looking at her. "Edinburgh, is that where he worked before?" "Before me," Beck said, as if that explained everything. In a way it did. "He says the buildings there are older, but the brick here is better." "I don't know what that means, but he explained it and it made sense when he said it. He's good at explaining things." Bex nodded seriously. "He explained what happened to my mum, not the first time. The first time he just said she went away. But then I asked more questions and he explained all of it." She was quiet for a moment, scuffing her boot against a clean patch of restored sidewalk. "I think it's better to know things, even hard things." Sloane felt the sentence land somewhere specific. "I think so too," she said. Cole appeared at Bex's shoulder with 2 cups of hot chocolate. One for her, produced from a thermos she realized he must have brought specifically. The other he handed to Sloane without asking if she wanted it. She took it. It was excellent. "She giving you her opinions?" he asked. "Yes," Sloane said. "Good," he said, and looked at his daughter with an expression that had no armor in it at all. The board tour was a Thursday morning in early November. 8 people in good coats trying to look like they were comfortable in a construction site, which none of them were. Cole walked them through the building with a kind of quiet authority that Sloane hadn't seen from him in the same way before. Not because he was performing, but because he was in his element, and it showed. He knew this building the way most people knew their own homes. He showed them the structural fix, explaining in plain language what the original assessment had missed and what a partial collapse would have meant, not just for the building but for the liability, for the timeline, for the adjacent properties. He showed them the octopuses, each tiny carved figure now cleaned and cataloged, and explained that the original architect had hidden similar motifs in 7 buildings across the city, only 2 of which survived, and that the Brackmore was one of them. He showed them Bergstrom's sign. The letters were applied directly to the brick in 1934, he said, standing in front of the east face where the gilt had re-emerged. "The family ran this building for 60 years. When we restore this, we're not just preserving a material. We're maintaining a record that says people were here, that they built something, that it mattered." He looked at the board without performing anything. "I can't make that case in numbers, but I can show you what you'd be agreeing to manage if you chose correctly." Sloane watched Caldwell. He was looking at the sign with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not calculating, not checking his phone, just looking. Douglas Price's offer was on the table. It would still be on the table on Monday. But in this moment, standing in November light in a building that had become readable again, Sloane thought, people trust what they can touch. She'd put that in her board presentation. She hadn't told Cole she was going to use it. In the hallway afterward, while her board members talked among themselves and Arthur distributed copies of the revised project report, Cole fell into step beside her. "Caldwell," he said quietly. "I saw. He'll vote with you. You can't know that. He was looking at the sign when I was talking about what's worth keeping," Cole said. "People who've lost things recognize that conversation." Sloane stopped walking. What did he lose? His wife, 3 years ago. There was a profile in the Financial Post. Cole glanced at her. "I do the work correctly. That applies to preparation." She stared at him. "You researched my board members." "I researched the people who were going to decide whether this building gets managed by someone who knows what they're doing or handed to Price." He said it without apology. "Same way I researched the load-bearing issue. You find the weak points before they become failures." Sloane didn't know whether to be unsettled or grateful. She settled on both. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." He looked toward the east face where Bergstrom's sign caught the morning light. Monday's still Monday. The vote was 5-3 in favor of retaining the portfolio. Caldwell voted with Sloane. 2 other board members who'd been listed as uncertain came down on her side after the tour in ways she hadn't predicted. Douglas Price left the meeting before the formal end, which told her exactly how certain he'd been of the outcome going in. She called Cole from the parking structure. 5-3, she said. A pause. Then, good? That's it? Just good? What do you want me to say? Something that acknowledges 6 weeks of work and a Thursday morning in the cold. She could hear the shift in his breathing that she'd come to recognize as the thing he did instead of laughing. You did the work. I just showed people a building, Cole Sloane. There it was again. Her name in his voice, which she'd been pretending wasn't something she noticed. Come to dinner, she said. Not planned, not strategic, not a meeting, not a debrief. Dinner. Silence. Then what about Bex? Bring her. Another pause, longer. She'll talk the entire time. I'm counting on it. The restaurant she chose was small, Italian, the kind of place with paper on the tables where children could draw. Bex drew an octopus, naturally, inevitably, with confident lines and entirely too many arms. She explained to the waiter that octopuses had 3 hearts, which the waiter received with more grace than most adults would have. Cole watched his daughter explain cephalopod biology to a man trying to take their pasta order, and his face did the thing it did. No armor, just warmth, just the particular kind of love that comes from choosing someone small and complicated and completely surprising every single day. Sloane watched Cole watching Bex and thought about things she wasn't ready to say out loud. She told me you said the Brackmore was the most interesting project since Edinburgh. Sloane said when the waiter had escaped with their orders. Cole looked over. She tells you things. She does. Edinburgh was a different kind of work. Older buildings, longer history, but the principle is the same. He picked up his water. The work matters because the history matters. You're not just fixing a building. You're deciding what we're going to keep. What made you leave? The question landed in the space between them and sat there. Cole looked at his water for a moment. Charlotte died, he said. Charlotte, Bex's mother, finally named. We'd been planning to come back to Canada. Her family's in Manitoba. It just happened before we were ready. He set the glass down. I figured if we were going to be here anyway, we might as well be here with intention. Intention, Sloane said. Bex deserved somewhere that felt like it was chosen. Not somewhere we ended up. He glanced at his daughter, who was now drawing what appeared to be an octopus riding a bicycle. I had to figure out what I was building, not just the projects. The life. Sloane thought about her own life, the 4 years of building Hartwell's portfolio, the 70-hour weeks, the board battles, the way she'd structured everything around the work, because the work was the thing she knew how to control. She was very good at controlling it. I think I forgot to do that, she said. Cole looked at her. Not assessment this time. Something different, something careful and direct in the way he was always direct. You're doing it now, he said. Isn't that what tonight is? Tonight is dinner. Tonight is something you chose, he said. That counts. Bex looked up from her drawing. Did you know, she said to Sloane with the gravity of a scientist presenting findings, that octopuses are actually really bad at riding bikes because their arms are too long? I didn't know that, Sloane said. I made it up. But it's probably true. Cole pressed his hand to his eyes. Sloane laughed, actually laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere you'd forgotten existed. The weeks after the board vote settled into something that didn't have a clean name. The project continued. The daily logs kept coming from Arthur. The detailed notes kept coming from Cole. But Sloane found herself at the site more than the project required, and less than she was willing to justify professionally. She helped Bex with homework on a Wednesday evening when Cole had a late supplier call. Bex had been at the office because the after-school program had been canceled, and there was apparently no one else to ask. Sloane had found her sitting in the reception area doing long division with the focused resentment of a person who considers the question personally offensive. Why do we have to know this? Bex asked. Phones exist. Phones can fail, Sloane said. Power goes out, battery dies. You need to be able to do things yourself. Bex looked at her with Cole's exact expression, waiting to see if the answer holds up. That's actually reasonable, Bex said, and returned to her long division. When Cole came to collect her an hour later, he found them both at the conference table. Bex's homework completed, Sloane on her laptop, a shared silence that had apparently been comfortable enough that neither of them had broken it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not saying anything. She's good at math, Sloane said. She just needs someone to explain why it matters. His voice was quiet. She does. He was looking at Sloane the way he sometimes looked at the Brackmore brick, like he was trying to understand what was underneath. She looked back and didn't pretend she wasn't. The crisis arrived in January. Not a board crisis, not a building crisis, those she could handle. This was the kind of crisis that arrives quietly, in the form of a piece of information you can't unknow once you have it. Sloane found it in the Provincial Heritage Authority's internal correspondence, shared with her as the project lead for the Brackmore, a routine transfer of documentation. Buried in a file of archive materials was a memorandum from 11 years ago, written in Edinburgh, regarding the forced departure of a senior consultant from a heritage firm over an allegation of professional misconduct. The consultant's name in the memo was not Cole Merritt, but the project referenced, a restoration of a 19th century textile mill in the Scottish borders, was one of only 3 such projects completed in that region in that period, and the details of the work described in the memo matched precisely the methodology she'd seen Cole use on the Brackmore. She sat with it for 3 days before she asked him. She chose the Brackmore. On a Thursday morning, no Arthur, no crew, just the 2 of them walking the now familiar interior in the winter light that came through the newly restored windows. She'd learned that Cole said difficult things most easily when he was moving, when he had the work around him. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to tell me the truth." He stopped, looked at her. "All right." She told him what she'd found, watched his face through it. He didn't look away. "The name in that memo is different from yours," she said. "Yes, but the project is yours." "Yes." She waited. Cole walked to the east window, the one that looked out toward the front of the building where Bergstrom's sign had re-emerged. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the street. "I worked under a senior partner," he said. "He had a client relationship I didn't know about, a property developer who wanted a heritage designation modified, significantly modified, in a way that would have allowed demolition of the protected elements. My partner agreed to it, altered the assessment documentation. He was quiet for a moment. I found out. I reported it to the provincial authority in Scotland, and I was asked to submit a resignation in exchange for the investigation not touching my name." "That's backwards," Sloane said carefully. "My partner had 20 years of relationships in the industry, and I had 3. He also had a better lawyer." Cole's voice was level, but she heard what was underneath it now. Not bitterness, exactly. Something that had been bitterness a long time ago and had calcified into something harder and less volatile. "I resigned. I left Scotland. I spent 18 months doing nothing in particular, and then Charlotte died and I needed to build something that was mine, that I could control. That was done correctly." He turned to look at her. "That's why the firm is 3 people. That's why I don't scale, don't subcontract to people I haven't personally vetted, don't take projects I can't stand behind entirely. Why didn't you tell me? Because the name in the memo isn't mine and the conduct wasn't mine." He held her gaze. "And because I didn't know if you'd see the difference." The silence in the building was the particular winter quiet of thick walls and good restoration, insulating, settled. "I see the difference," Sloane said. Something moved in his face, not relief. More like a door being unlocked that had been locked for a long time. "There's something else," he said. "My partner, former partner, is Douglas Price's brother-in-law." Sloane stared at him. "Sorry? That's how Price knew to bring the bid when he did. He would have known I was on the project. Would have known that if Aldermach came in, I'd be gone." Cole's jaw tightened, the first time she'd seen him show something that close to anger. "He's not interested in the buildings. He's interested in removing people who know what they're looking at." The pieces settled into place, not a corporate bid. A play to clear the board and replace expertise with compliance. "Why didn't you tell me this before the vote?" "Because I thought you'd think it was personal," he said, "and I didn't want it to be personal. I wanted you to keep the portfolio because it was right, not because I was angry." Sloane sat down on a window ledge that had been cleaned and refinished 6 weeks ago and thought about a man who'd lost his career to someone else's dishonesty, rebuilt it with deliberate, quiet precision, and then chosen to walk back into the same fight, not out of revenge but because he believed the work mattered. "It was always personal," she said. "It was personal for you the day you walked into that meeting." "Yes." He came to sit beside her on the ledge, not close, but present. "Is that a problem?" She thought about the past months, the morning light on the brick, the octopuses, Beck's explaining cephalopod anatomy with the confidence of someone who knows they're being listened to, long division in the conference room. The Thursday morning cold. "No," she said. "I think it might be the only way anything worth doing ever gets done." Cole was quiet. Outside, Bergstrom's sign caught the winter light. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," he said. "You were protecting yourself?" "I was. And I was protecting you from having to make a decision with information that wasn't yours to carry yet." He looked over at her. "That was wrong. You should have had the information." "Yes," she said. "I should have. And I'm choosing to believe you know that now. I do." They sat on the newly restored ledge in the empty building in the February light and didn't fill the silence with anything. Spring came and the Brackmore project moved toward completion. The provincial authority approved the final heritage assessment on first submission, as they always did with Cole's work. The building was photographed for the authorities' records and for an architectural magazine that ran a half-page on the re-emerging octopus motifs. Someone from the University of Manitoba called Sloane to ask if she'd consider a public opening event. She said yes. She said yes to other things too that spring. Dinner on a Friday, just the three of them, a different Italian place with paper on the tables. A Saturday afternoon at the Forks because Bex had seen the skating and made her opinions known. A Sunday in Cole's workshop, a garage attached to the house in Wolseley where he did smaller restoration work, where Sloane sat on a stool and handed him tools she mostly couldn't identify while he repaired a piece of 19th century cabinetry someone had brought in from the Assiniboine Valley. "You don't have to stay," he said the first Sunday. "I know," Sloane said. She stayed. Bex came in at some point with a book about marine biology and a very specific question about whether squid were smarter than octopuses, which Cole answered seriously and at length. Sloane listened to the two of them debate the intelligence of cephalopods in a garage in Wolseley on a Sunday in March and thought, this is what it looks like. Not the performing of a life, the actual building of one. One evening, walking back to her car after a dinner that had extended well past 9, Cole stopped on the front step of his house and said her name. "Sloane." She stopped. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I should say that first. I'm good at work, and I'm good at Bex, and I used to be good at having someone beside me, and then I forgot how. Spent a long time thinking that was fine." She waited. "It's not fine," he said. "I've been aware of that for a few months. Since November, roughly, since the board tour. Before that. Since the Monday morning in October when you came to look at the brick, and you just stood there and let the building be what it was." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't try to manage it. You just looked." She remembered that morning. The light, the faded letters. The fact that she hadn't checked her phone once in 2 hours. "I'm not easy," Sloane said. "I work too much and I make decisions without consulting people, and I have approximately 15 years of not asking for help built into my muscle memory." "I know," he said. "I'm not easy either. I have a daughter who will have opinions about everything you do forever, and I disappear into buildings for weeks at a time. And I find it genuinely hard to talk about anything that matters until I've thought about it for at least 48 hours. I've noticed the 48 hours. Has it been a problem?" She thought about it honestly. "No. It's actually been useful. Most people say things before they've thought them through." He stepped down to the sidewalk, even ground between them now. "So, this is happening," he said. "Not a question." "I think it's been happening for a while," Sloane said. "I think we've both been doing that thing where you know something and you keep working around it." "Yeah." A pause. "I'm sorry it took me this long to say it directly. 48 hours. Try 4 months." She laughed. He didn't look away. The building opened in June. The public event was a Thursday evening, warm for Winnipeg at that time of year, with the kind of long light that made everything look deliberate. People came, more than Sloane expected, including a number of older residents who remembered the Brackmore from previous decades, who stood in the restored lobby and said things like "I remember," "when" and "there it is" to each other, in voices that had something in them she couldn't name. Beck stood in front of the octopus corbelling on the 4th floor exterior and explained to anyone who would listen that the architect had been Icelandic and that octopuses had 3 hearts and that the ones carved here were very good even if they were too small. Several older residents photographed them with their phones. One woman said she'd walked past this building every day for 30 years and never known they were there. "Now you do," Bex told her with great satisfaction. Cole stood beside Sloane while his daughter held court about cephalopod biology to a small group of pensioners. "She's going to be a problem," he said. "She's going to be magnificent," Sloane said. Cole looked at her. Then he did the thing he'd been doing more often now. Not performing anything, not calculating anything, just looking at her like she was something he'd found beneath the surface that he hadn't expected and was still getting used to. "Yeah," he said. "She is." Later, after the crowd had thinned and Arthur had locked the building and Bex had fallen asleep against Sloane's shoulder in the back of the car on the way home, completely boneless. The way children go when they're certain they're safe, Cole drove in comfortable silence, and Sloane held still so Bex could sleep. "This is not what I expected," Sloane said quietly. 6 months ago, what did you expect?" "A contractor, a contract, a building. And instead," she looked at Bex's sleeping face, at the city moving past the window, at the shape of the life she was apparently now inside of, which had arrived not in any dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones. Early mornings and cold air, and a thermos of hot chocolate and homework on a Wednesday, and a carving of an octopus hidden under 100 years of stucco. Something I didn't know I was missing, she said. Cole didn't say anything, but his hand found hers across the console, and he held on, and the city kept going past the windows, and it was enough. More than enough. It was exactly what it was, chosen, real, and in no way finished.